So Podfics. Today we're going to be reading It's Okay by Bema Cabo. I don't know if they're doing any more, but right now there are 3 chapters and 10,000 words. And here's a summary. Sometimes Izuku just needs a hug when it all gets too much for him. But if he can't go to his mom for what he needs or go to All Might, who will he go to? It's simple. Aizawa Sensei. Will his teacher be able to give him what he needs, or will he crack and fall apart under the pressure of his life? Chapter 1. A Comfort. It could never be said that Midoriya Izuku did not have good days. He did. Days where he could smile without having to force it, could not feel the need to shy away when people approached him, or talked to him, or really did anything to interact with him. Days where he did well in his school assignments, where he could laugh with his friends and feel like he fit in. Today was not one of those days, nor had yesterday been, or the day before. But really, it was fine. He was just a bit jumpy, felt nervous, especially when his friends all tried to talk to him and have him join their conversation. It was fine. They wanted his opinion. It was good. It was strange and unusual, for him at least, but it was good. Except when he had to force himself to smile, to put on a brave face, and force his tired mind and body to act like they were fine. His training had been difficult lately, too, where he was trying to get stronger as fast as he could, so that he could be the symbol of peace like All Might wanted him to be. And sometimes it all just got to be too much for him, where he felt like his smile could crack and disappear at any moment, or he just knew that he would flinch and shy away if one of his friends approached him, a smile on their face or a friendly look in their eyes. He couldn't do it. He just couldn't. All Might was telling him that he needed to be prepared, and he had been working more, practicing with his quirk more, working out more. He was getting up earlier to be able to have more time to practice and study. But then he was tired and distracted, and so unfocused with his schoolwork. His grades had slipped just a bit, but it was enough to throw his mood off even more. And today, it was just too much. He felt like everything was crashing down on him, like the world was on his shoulders and he was going to crumble and shatter beneath it. He was tired and edgy and nervous, and he just wanted a break. But what he really wanted was a hug. He wanted to be wrapped in warm, comforting arms and to be told that it was okay. Not that it would be all right, or that he was fine, or even that it would get better. No. What he wanted, what he needed, was to be told that it was okay, that it was okay to feel the way he felt, that it was okay to need his space for some days, that it was okay for him to just be him, to feel what he was feeling. He guessed. He just needed to feel justified. Normally, he would think of going to his mom, but he was on campus, and she was probably busy, and she wouldn't really be able to say that to him. Anyway, she would tell him that it was going to be all right, sure, and she would probably cry while she was doing it too. Izuku didn't want someone to cry with him and tell him that it would be all right, because yes, he knew he was most likely going to cry, and he wanted someone else to hold him, to be the strong one for him, and tell him it was okay. His mom couldn't do that. The next person he would think to go to was All Might. Because yes, he kind of thought of All Might as a dad to him. Kind of. He looked up to him. He always has. And yes, he was a strong presence, and he definitely wouldn't cry if Izuku went to him with this. But he wouldn't tell him the right things either. He would tell Izuku that he would get better, that he was just going through a rough patch, but he could make himself stronger until this no longer affected him, until he could be the best hero he could be. He would tell him that he would get better so he could be a hero to others. And that just wasn't what Izuku wanted to hear either. He didn't want to be told that he could get better and that he had to be strong for others. He wanted to be told that it was okay for him to be like this. He wanted to be told that it was okay for him to not be strong, to be weak, to just need help sometimes. So he almost gave up, his tired eyes sliding closed as he sat in his dorm room. Those were only 2 adults in his life that he thought he could go to, and they wouldn't be able to help him. A tear leaked out of his closed eye and fell to his bed below, which he was sitting on. He wanted comfort. He wanted a hug. He wanted to be told it's okay. He wanted warmth. He wanted support. He wanted firmness. He wanted someone solid to lean on, someone who would support him, hold him up, lead him, let him lean on them when he was strong enough until he was strong enough to support himself, and would just let him be himself until he was strong enough. He wanted. His eyes snapped open, and he sat up straighter. He just stared blankly ahead, and then snapped back to reality, quickly swinging his legs over the side of the bed and standing up. The doorknob rattled as he grabbed it, his hands grappling with it for a minute before it finally opened, and then he was already off down the hallway, his door slamming shut when he was already down the hall. Most of his classmates were in the common room of the dorms, since school had just let out a half hour ago. He had waved off his friends' requests to stay with them and hang out, saying he had a lot of homework to do, and he did, just he wanted a hug. And he was going to find the one person who could give it to him. He ignored his friends' calls, rushing over to the entrance and slipping on his shoes before hurrying outside, his shoes scuffling on the paved walkway. It only took a minute for him to get back to the main building of the school, and there he slowed. He knew it was against the rules to run in the building, and as much as he was in a hurry, he knew better than to disregard the rules until it was an emergency, unless it was an emergency, like a villain attack or something. It took another 5 minutes before he got to his destination. Those 5 minutes were filled with insecurities, his mind telling him that it was a bad idea, that he was being selfish, and that he probably wouldn't even get what he wanted. And he almost turned back. Almost. But he needed this. He really did. He was going to break apart, to shatter into 1,000 tiny pieces, if he didn't find someone to hold him together. And after those 5 minutes, he was standing outside the door to his teacher's lounge in the school building, where they had their computers set up. There were a few private offices for if they needed some privacy without having to walk through the halls to their own personal office. Izuku's hands hovered over the door, fingers curled and knuckles facing the hardwood of the door. Taking a deep breath and holding it, he allowed his hand to continue its movement, knuckles softly but firmly rapping on the wood 3 times, just enough to be polite, but not too much that he seemed too impatient. After he knocked, he slowly let out a breath he had taken in, standing at attention to wait for someone to answer. He didn't have to wait long, not even half a minute after he knocked, he could already hear footsteps coming closer to the door. Then the door was being opened. President Mike was on the other side, still in hero uniform, and his face lit up in his signature grin when he saw Izuku. "Little listener," he called out, his fingers reaching up to push his sunglasses farther up on his nose. "Did you need something?" He was leaning against the door, relaxed, but Izuku could see the underlying tenseness about him, how he was ready to move at a moment's notice. It was one of the things Izuku loved and respected the most in his teachers, especially President Mike. They were casual, friendly, open, but they were also still pro-heroes, and were always ready to move at a moment's notice, in case there was emergency. "Hello, Yamada Sensei," Izuku said, bowing. He was trying to keep a straight face, but he could feel his expression ready to falter, to fall into a frown, at any second. Yeah, he really did need a hug. Is Aizawa Sensei here? He asked, his hands held straight at his sides. He sure is, listener, President Mike assured. He shifted until he was no longer leaning on the door, and instead opened it wider, a clear invitation for Izuku to enter. Why don't you come in, and I'll let him know you're looking for him, yeah? Izuku nodded and tried to smile, although he knew it was probably a little wobbly. He stepped into the room, stepping to the side of the door as President Mike went further in, most likely looking for Aizawa Sensei, as he said he would. Izuku took this time to look around the room. He had been here before, mostly when All Might wanted to talk to him, but also to deliver documents or a message for some of the teachers, the occasional time. It was still the same, a lounge area to the right, with some couches and easy chairs, as well as a small TV. The teachers' desks and workstations with their computers along the left side of the room. A small kitchenette in the front left corner before the workspaces started, and along the back wall were a few of those private offices. All that could be seen of them were their closed doors, but Izuku knew they were there. Right now, the only people in the room that he could see were him, Midnight, Ectoplasm, and Power Loader. Midnight and Ectoplasm were on their computers, and Power Loader was over by the coffee machine, most likely making him a cup. He could also see President Mike over by the set of couches in the area, which is most likely where Aizawa Sensei was. Izuku started to feel guilty, knowing that he was probably disturbing Aizawa Sensei's nap. Before he had more time to wallow in that guilt, the form of Aizawa Sensei was rising above the couch, his signature yellow sleeping bag falling down off his shoulders as he stepped out of it and turned to where Izuku was standing by the door. Izuku held eye contact with him for a moment, then looked away, ducking his head. After a second, he could hear footsteps coming towards him, and when he looked up, he could see his teacher getting closer, his hands in his pockets, posture slouched, and his standard blank expression on his face. Izuku couldn't hold eye contact with him, having to constantly look away to the floor before looking back into his teacher's eyes. He could see something there, some emotion. He thought it looked like concern. Either way, he was surprisingly feeling better just by his teacher being there. There was something altogether comforting about Aizawa Sensei's presence, and it made Izuku want to break down right there. He managed to hold it in, though since he didn't want anyone else to see him break down, the other teachers were still in the room, although Power Loader had now moved back to his own desk, coffee cup in hand, and President Mike had crossed the room to his own station after waking up Aizawa Sensei. "Problem, child?" Aizawa Sensei greeted. "What did you need?" He was still slouched, and would look relaxed and dismissive to the casual observer, but Izuku could tell that he was paying attention and was ready for anything, just like President Mike had been. Gathering his courage, Izuku took a breath, opened his mouth, and he was nervous. He kept trying to look Aizawa Sensei in the eyes, but he just couldn't. His cheeks flushed, and his eyes once more were averted to the floor. How stupid was he? He came all this way, bothered the other teachers, woke Aizawa Sensei up, all because he wanted a hug. He was acting like a little kid, rather than a hero student. How pathetic was he? He opened his mouth again, either to try to excuse himself, or to try to ask again. He wasn't sure which. In all honesty, he wasn't sure what he even wanted to ask. He really hadn't rehearsed this, or thought it through at all. Was he supposed to just say, "Oh, hey, Sensei, can you just give me a hug and tell me it's okay? That's in your job description, right?" But before he could even decide which route he was going to take, Aizawa Sensei beat him to it. He must have seen something on his face and his expression, because he gestured with his head to the back of the room and took his hands out of his pockets. "Let's go into one of the offices, problem child. We can talk there. Is that okay?" he asked, looking directly at Izuku, but not in a way that made him feel judged. No, the look was all patience, inviting, accepting. He offered a solution to the problem at hand, and was waiting to see if it was all right with Izuku. It was nice. Izuku appreciated having the choice while still not feeling pressured. Giving a jerky shake of his head, Izuku started to fidget with his hands. I took a step forward to follow after Aizawa Sensei. When the black-clad man started walking towards the back of the room, posture showed loose and relaxed. Izuku let out a breath and sped up a bit to keep up with his teacher, following a few feet behind him as they passed the other teachers, who paid them no mind, and came to the private rooms in the back. Aizawa Sensei reached out to the handle of one of the doors and opened it, gesturing for Izuku to go in first. After the green net had entered the room, Aizawa Sensei followed behind him. He swung the door halfway closed and then turned back to Izuku. You want the door closed, or would you rather have it open? Again, he was offering a choice, and Izuku felt no pressure either way. Closed, please, he stammered out, fingers still twisting into each other's harshly as his nerves started to act up again. This was it. This was the moment he's been wanting, but also the moment where he had to ask his teacher for a hug. It was way out of his usual interactions with this teacher, and probably way out of said teacher's comfort zone, and usual interactions with students too. But somehow, Izuku just felt that a hug from Aizawa Sensei would make it all feel okay. Maybe not perfect or even good, just okay. That's all he wanted. He could feel the tears starting to gather behind his eyes again, could feel the telltale prickle that signaled they would be flowing down his face. Midoriya, what's wrong? Aizawa Sensei asked. He was standing by the door sill, which was now closed, a few feet from Izuku. It was too far, in his opinion. I've noticed you've been a bit off lately. You seem distracted. I didn't want to pry, since I believed you could figure it out on your own. If something was bothering you. But I'm here if you need me, you know. So, problem child, tell me, what's wrong? It was said as a statement, but there was an underlying hint of something else in his words, almost a question, but not. It was more like an offer, like every other action and expression of Aizawa Sensei's since Izuku got there. It was open, free from judgment. It was a choice, an offer. It was open, and it was inviting. Izuku ducked his head, his hands separated from each other, and now fisted at his sides. He hoped his bangs hid the tears growing in his eyes, but as soon as the first sob jerked his body, he knew he couldn't hide the way his shoulders jolted with it. His head curled down even farther towards his chest, and his fingers moved to grip his pant legs. Great, Aizawa Sensei had offered, and he still couldn't voice what he wanted. A few more sobs shook his body, and he felt the tears trailing down his face. A few of them reached his trembling lips, and as he opened his mouth to gasp in a breath, the salty liquid leaked through, coating his mouth with the taste of his tears. He could hear soft footsteps coming closer to him, and he slammed his eyes shut, not wanting to see Aizawa Sensei. He wished a man couldn't see him. Wished his teacher wasn't seeing him break down for seemingly no reason. The footsteps stopped right in front of him, and still Izuku didn't open his eyes. It was until a heavy, soft, firm, gentle, warm hand landed on his shoulder that his eyes snapped open and his head snapped up along with them. Aizawa Sensei's face was still smooth, relaxed, the scar beneath his right eye being the only break in his expression, but his face was slightly softer than usual, more gentle, more calm. It was soothing, and his eyes, they held so much emotion, so much gentleness. Izuku took in another gasping breath, trying to get his sobbing under control. It wasn't working. Midoriya, tell me what you need. The hand stayed on his shoulder, just a firm weight and warmth that Izuku could latch onto. I need... Izuku started off shakily, trying to get his voice to cooperate without trembling. I just want a hug. His shoulders jerked several times as he said that, and with each jerk, with each sob, his head sunk lower. The tears were gathering at his chin, dripping off his face, and landing with soft thuds on the carpeted floor. He clenched his eyes tightly shut, not wanting to see the look of disgust on Aizawa Sensei's face, not wanting to see as the man turned on his heel and left the room. For Izuku was sure that was what he would do. After all, what kind of teacher would stay after his student just asked him for a hug, while sobbing like a baby? He tried to suppress another sob when he felt Aizawa Sensei take his hand off his shoulder, sure that the hero was about to leave. He couldn't suppress the sob, just like he couldn't suppress the way his entire body jolted when, instead of walking away, Aizawa Sensei stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Izuku's shoulder and back, pulling him close to himself and surrounding Izuku with warmth. Izuku's body stiffened at first, and his sobs paused for a moment from his shock, and then he was relaxing in his teacher's arms, going limp like jelly, and reaching his hands up to grab at the front of Aizawa Sensei's shirt. He was sure that he was getting the shirt wet where his face was pressed into it, and probably wrinkling it where his fingers were curled into it harshly, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Not when he could feel Aizawa Sensei rubbing large, slow circles into his back, when he felt the man's strong arms holding him up, supporting him, not when the warmth of his teacher's entire body was surrounding him. It was soft, it was gentle, it was warm, it was firm and strong and comforting, and it was everything Izuku wanted. Hey, shh, it's all right, you're okay, Aizawa Sensei's voice murmured. His hands on Izuku's back went from rubbing circles to just rubbing up and down. His words made Izuku cry even harder, and his hands fisted in Aizawa Sensei's shirt, pulling down on it, likely stretching the material. Midoriya, tell me what's wrong, Aizawa Sensei said, one hand coming up to run through Izuku's hair. His curls were pulled back, then bouncing back into place again. It was calming and soothing. I just wanted a hug, Izuku forced out. He sniffled and took a wheezing breath in, then hid his face even farther into Aizawa's stomach. I'm tired and everything is just hard. I'm sorry. This is lame. I'm so pathetic. He tried to pull away from Aizawa Sensei, but was stopped as the strong arms held on tighter to him and wrapped around his shaking frame more solidly. Izuku's eyes snapped wide open in shock, tears still streaming down his face. His breath hitched, and he craned his neck up to be able to look at his teacher. Aizawa Sensei's head was bowed, his face pressed into Izuku's dark green curls. You're not pathetic for needing a hug, Izuku, Aizawa Sensei said, Izuku's name sounding strange yet familiar in his voice. It's okay. You can have a hug when you need one, or even when you just want one, and it's okay if you do need one. Do you understand? Izuku breathed out a deep breath, eyes closing again. He could feel his heart, which had been pounding furiously in his chest before, starting to slow down. His whole body relaxed. His head fell down to rest softly against Aizawa Sensei's chest, and his legs slowly started relaxing until it felt like they would just give out. His arms and hands had just started relaxing, loosening their hold on his teacher's shirt. When he felt himself being shifted, immediately his eyes snapped open, and his hands clenched into Aizawa Sensei's shirt even tighter than before. His legs still felt wobbly, and his breathing was starting to speed up again. Shh, it's okay. I just wanted to move us to the couch. Is that all right? Aizawa Sensei's calm voice drifted down, the man's hands resuming their steady motion of rubbing across his back. Izuku nodded, his hair and face scratching up against Aizawa Sensei's shirt, lifting the material, then letting it fall back into place. Aizawa Sensei didn't move for a couple of seconds, and Izuku belatedly realized that the man couldn't move while Izuku was clinging to him. He reluctantly released his grip on the man's shirt and leaned back, keeping his face turned to the floor. He was about to turn and step away entirely, but was stopped when Aizawa Sensei's arm wrapped around his shoulders and drew him back in a side hug. It wasn't quite as nice as the full-on hug from before, but it was still warm and firm and just as reassuring. "That's okay?" Aizawa Sensei asked, squeezing Izuku's shoulder gently. The greenette hummed, tucking his head into Aizawa Sensei's side, under his arm. Together, they shuffled over to the couch, which was up against the opposite wall and to the right of the door, and sat down, with Izuku still tucked up to Aizawa Sensei's left side. The wall to the left of the door had a desk, and the side of the room they were on had two brown couches facing each other, with a coffee table in between them. Izuku curled his legs up onto the couch, and leaned fully into Aizawa Sensei's side. "You good, Izuku?" the man asked, resting his free right hand on Izuku's head, with his left hand still circling around Izuku's back, arm pressed against the back of the couch. "Yeah," Izuku croaked out, sniffling a bit. The tears had stopped falling, but he could still feel the salt crusted on his cheeks from where the tears had trailed. "You can talk about it if you want," Aizawa Sensei said. His hand was still on Izuku's head, but his own head was facing forward. Gaze locked on something across the room. It gave Izuku the chance to think without feeling like he was being watched, and the way he said it, more like an offer than a question, gave him the openness to refuse. After thinking for a moment, Izuku nodded his head, firmly, knowing that Aizawa Sensei would feel it. He wanted to tell someone about it, and he wanted that someone to be Aizawa Sensei. So Izuku talked. He talked about the things that had been bothering him for the last few days, about the things that did bother him on a regular basis, but that he thought were fine and he could ignore, but didn't go into too much detail about his past, because that would inevitably bring up questions about his quirk. But he talked about other things that he couldn't tell to even his mom or to All Might, for fear they wouldn't understand. But Aizawa Sensei understood, or at least, he listened without needing to understand. Izuku was in tears for most of the time while he was talking, but Aizawa Sensei didn't judge him for that. He just kept his hands and arms steadily around Izuku, being a warmth and a firmness as the boy ranted, his arms gesturing around himself wildly. Towards the end of his rant, when he had finally talked himself out, after who knows how long, and there were still tears trickling down his face, but not flowing quite as hard anymore, he tucked himself onto his teacher's side, hands curled in his lap, and face pressed into the man's shirt. Aizawa Sensei's arm was still around his back. It must have been numb by now with his hand resting comfortably on Izuku's shoulder. His other hand switched between carding Izuku's curls and rubbing steadily up and down his leg, just above the knee. Both motions were soothing to Izuku, and he found his eyes drooping as they lay there. He didn't want to fall asleep yet. After he had been silent for a moment, with Aizawa Sensei had just silently continuing his motions, the man finally spoke. "It's okay to feel that way, you know. You don't have to be happy all the time, and while you shouldn't have to feel uncomfortable around your classmates, around your friends, there's nothing wrong with you feeling that way. I don't like people much either, and I'm not the biggest fan of physical touch, so I understand." At that point, Izuku's head snapped up, and he tried to pull away from the man, eyes wide. He started babbling out apologies, but was stopped by Aizawa Sensei tightening his hold on him, and by his voice. "Shh, it's okay, Izuku. You're fine. Physical touch may not be my favorite thing, but it's not like I absolutely hate it. Besides, I think you needed this more than you thought. Which brings me to my next point." At this, he finally looked away from the far wall and down at Izuku. The greenette had to swallow back tears at the soft look he saw in his teacher's eyes. "Izuku Midoriya, you never have to feel shamed for needing something, especially if it's just a form of physical contact, a hug even. Different people need different things to have a healthy mental state, and for you, I think you just need positive physical contact. I'm sorry that you can't be at home with your mother, and that sometimes you don't feel comfortable around your classmates, but you can always come to me for whatever you need, even if it's just a hug. Especially if it's just a hug. That's what I'm here for all of you. I'm here to give you what you need to be healthy. It's only logical that I do that in any way I can. So this is fine. You needing a hug is fine. And while I don't want you to be sad, I do want you to know that it is all right to be sad. That just makes the time when you're happy all the sweeter and happen more often. Got it, problem child? He ruffled his hair as he said the last part of his speech, and Izuku just nodded, mouth slightly open in awe. That was the longest he had ever heard Aizawa Sensei talk, outside of a lecture in the classroom. And even that was pushing it, and the words had been so sincere and exactly what Izuku had wanted to hear. He nodded again, reaching a hand up to rub away the tears that were building in his eyes again. Tucking himself back into Aizawa Sensei's side, Izuku let out a deep, slightly shaky breath and let himself relax. A minute later, he was sound asleep, chest rising and falling slowly. He was comfortable and warm and safe and even almost happy again. Everything was okay. If, after that, Izuku would come to the teacher's lounge or the teacher's dorm looking for Aizawa Sensei, it only took one glance for the pro hero to know that Izuku needed a hug. If that was the case, he would bring them to a private room and hold him securely for however long the boy needed. Sometimes, Izuku would even just find him in an empty hallway, walk towards him in a daze, and wrap his arms around his teacher, pressing his face into the man's chest. When that happened, Aizawa Sensei would just loosely wrap his arms around the boy and return, and wait till he pulled away, usually wiping a few tears from his eyes. It was a unique relationship, only shown in those private moments between the two, but it was enough for them. One got comfort from a dependable adult figure in his life, and the other got the reassurance that his problem child was okay, and that he was in a healthy enough state of mental health. It was when Izuku didn't come for a hug for a while that Aizawa got worried. After all, that usually signaled that Izuku didn't think he deserved it, or that he thought Aizawa wouldn't want to help him. In those instances, Aizawa was the one to seek out his student and give him the comfort he needed. And that was okay, because he would be there for his problem child, and he always would be, for whatever he needed. Chapter 2. Empty Eyes. Summary. Midoriya needs a hug again, and this time he finds Aizawa in the halls. No warning or anything. Poor green bean. It was the end of the school day. The kids had been released from classes about 15 minutes prior, except the unlucky few who had detention, or those who had after-school activities or meetings. But that wasn't any of Shota's problem, since he didn't have any kids in detention or appointments to get to. So he was just on his way to the teacher's lounge, a file of essays to be graded tucked under his arms, when it happened. He had just been walking down the hallway, hands tucked in his pockets of the loose jumpsuit that was his pro hero outfit, and folder leveraged under his left arm. The teacher's lounge was just down the next hallway, so he sped up his steps a bit as he turned the last corner, but then he stopped. On the other side of the bench in the halls, a student stood, leaning up against a wall with their back, head bowed. Shota stood there, staring at his student, waiting for them to make the first move. The teenager's head slowly looked up, and Shota's heart clenched at the sight of the dead eyes. It wasn't normal to see those eyes so expressionless, them burning with conviction and determination, or flooded with tears. It wasn't normal to see those eyes so expressionless. He and everyone else was more used to seeing them burning with conviction and determination, or flooded with tears. They weren't supposed to be empty, and it was startling to see them that way now. But careful not to show how shocked the sight was to him, Shota kept a straight expression and loose posture, making himself as open and approachable as possible. He had more experience than was usual with with the specific child's emotions. Ever since the child had come to him a couple months back for a hug and a supporting presence, so he was ready and willing to do whatever the student needed of him. He just needed to know what that was. "Is something the matter, Midoriya?" He started off, his tone even and light. No hidden meaning in it besides an open question and invitation. He could only hope that the boy would recognize it for what it was, not knowing that it was coming, but wanting to be ready for anything. He carefully bent down and placed the folder of essays on the ground, freeing up his hands and arms. He was surprised and a bit confused when, without saying anything, Midoriya just walked towards him, slowly, face directed towards the floor, and no words, escaping his tightly drawn lips, not moving a muscle, but not tensing up. Shota stood there as Midoriya hesitantly but determinedly wrapped his arms around the man and hid his face in Shota's black jumpsuit. Shota brought his own arms up slowly, careful to wrap around Midoriya's back in return. When the boy showed no sign of flinching or shying away at his touch, he allowed himself to hold the teenager firmer, pulling him tight to his chest just as the first tears started to fall. Unlike Midoriya's usual tears, which would erupt like a volcano and flow like a waterfall, these were more akin to a trickling stream. Silent as they made their way down to the natural cracks and dents in his face, getting pressed up against the jumpsuit until they blurred into nothing but a damp spot on fabric. They kept coming, and Shota was sure he would have some wet spots on his clothes after, but that was the last thing on his mind at the moment. After a minute of them just standing there, Midoriya facing straight into Shota's chest and crying, Shota started rubbing his hands up and down Midoriya's back and opened his mouth. "Hey, kiddo, you want to move somewhere more private, or do you want to stay here for a bit?" His voice was light, almost melodic, but low and quiet. He hoped it would be soothing, but didn't realize just how soothing it was to his student. It loosened the tightening in Midoriya's chest, the crushing weight he had been feeling all day, and the boy's shoulders hitched, that becoming the first sob of many. Shota blinked in surprise at the change so suddenly, but he just shifted positions on his feet to a more relaxed posture and resumed the steady and soothing motions of his hands across Midoriya's back. His student's breath was shaky as he tried to breathe and cry at the same time, but Shota just shushed him quietly. As much as he was upset that his student was distressed, he was glad to hear the shaking breaths and feel the jerking, full of tears, sobs against his chest, as this meant the kid wasn't blocking his emotions anymore. But a person like Midoriya, who was usually so expressive and full of emotion, a boy who wore his heart on his sleeve for all to see and to be inspired by, it was one of the worst things for those around him to see him expressionless, in a daze of blankness, reflected on his face and in his mannerisms. It was painful for those who cared about him, and that's why Shoto's heart felt like it was being ripped to shreds when he saw his kid like that. "Shh, it's okay, Midoriya. I'm right here," he murmured into the kid's ears, his neck bent at an awkward angle so he could murmur it directly into the fluffy curls at the side of the kid's head. "Take your time. You're okay, right here. You're fine." Midoriya blubbered something incomprehensibly into his suit, but Shota didn't get the impression that it was anything meant to be understood or heard, so he didn't press his kid to repeat it. Instead, he just kept moving his hands up and down across the kid's spine, occasionally squeezing tighter for a few seconds to ground the kid and let him know he wasn't alone. Eventually, after Shota didn't know how long, Midoriya stepped back from him, sniffling and wiping a sleeved arm across his face to get rid of the residual tears. When he looked up at Shota, the man could see glimmering trails of dried tears on his cheeks, smudged from where they were pressed into the man's chest. But his gaze was drawn then to the boy's eyes. They were watery, still, but weren't empty anymore. Thankfully, now they reflected light, sending it back out to the rest of the world brightly, though a little more dimmed than usual. "Thanks, Sensei," Midoriya mumbled, sniffling once more, and avoiding his teacher's gaze. "It's not a problem, Midoriya," Shota replied. "I don't mind, you know." I know, Sensei, but I really do appreciate it, and I don't want to inconvenience you. You probably have something important to do." His eyes glanced down to the floor, and Shota's followed, seeing the file of essays he had placed there when he first saw Midoriya. "Is that folder yours? I probably should go so you can do your work. I'm sorry, I'll go now." Midoriya started to bow down low as he rambled with nerves, so Aizawa just sighed and put a hand on the boy's shoulder, letting the corners of his lips twitch up just for a second while Midoriya's head was still bowed, and no one else was around. He still had a reputation to maintain after all. He couldn't have anyone thinking he had gone soft, even if he had, especially for a certain green-haired student of his. "Midoriya," he said, meeting his student's eyes as the boy finally straightened, his wide, shocked eyes locking with Shota's concerned, steady ones. "You don't need to apologize. You will always be more important. There's nothing more important than your health, both mental and physical." Okay, Sensei," Midoriya stammered, a blush rising to his cheeks as he wrung his hands together. Sighing internally, and knowing that Midoriya still didn't fully understand, and would still apologize for things that weren't his fault, Shota just determined to keep reminding this kid of his worth, for as long as he as was needed, even if it took the rest of their life. He would try to make Midoriya see that he deserved kindness, deserved care and comfort and attention. He knew it would be a long journey, but he was willing to undertake it for his problem child. "Midoriya, do you want to go back to your dorm, or would you rather come to my office for some quiet? You could take a nap, or do schoolwork, or really whatever you would normally do." Midoriya was hesitating, but Shota could tell that he would accept the offer. Usually, or as usual it could be with only a few times in as many months of Midoriya coming to him for a hug, the boy would want some downtime to fully calm down before returning to his friends. They had been to Shota's office before, after a similar time where Midoriya needed some physical comfort, but Shota knew that Midoriya would still need the assurance that they could go there, and that he wouldn't be pressured to do anything other than what he wanted to do. Can we go to your office, please, Sensei?" Shota just nodded, and after bending down to pick up his folder, while Midoriya shuffled from foot to foot, he turned and led the way back down the hall to his own private office. Midoriya followed behind him, and when they got to the office, the boy headed straight for the comfiest couch, grabbing the soft, tan throw blanket off the back and curling up at the side, leaning against the armrest. He stared at Shota as the man set his work down at the small desk, and fell into the swiveling office chair. The teachers' offices didn't have their work computers in them. They were more for private meetings with the students if necessary. Shota could do his grading in there, though, as it didn't require the computer. Settling in, he swiveled to look at Midoriya first. "You good, kid?" The student nodded at him, right before a yawn split his face and he brought a hand, covered with a blanket, up to rub at his eyes. Hiding a soft smile in his capture weapon, Shota nodded back at him and turned his desk, mentally preparing himself for a long afternoon of marking messy essays. So, with Shota softly scratching at papers with a red pen, Midoriya slowly but surely calmed down and scooched down on the couch until he was laying down, with the steady presence of his favorite teacher in the room, and the phantom warmth of the man's secure arms around him, and his whispered words reassuring that he was okay. The boy fell asleep. An hour later, when Shota took a break to stretch out his back and rub at his tired eyes, he glanced over at his sleeping student, and on his smile graced his face, and he stared at his kid for a moment, taking in the sight and sound of his soft breaths, full of peace and contentment. That's all he wanted for his students, and for this child in particular. He was his problem child, and he wanted him to be happy. He would do whatever it took to make that happen for the rest of his life. Chapter 3. His Kid. Summary. Midoriya hasn't come to Aizawa since too long. Way too long. Aizawa needs to find his student and make sure he's okay before it's too late. It, strangely and not so strangely, happened when Aizawa was walking down the sidewalk one Saturday afternoon, returning from a quick grocery run to a convenience store. He had run out of a few things and took the opportunity the weekend offered to gather them, finally having a moment to relax and catch up on his own life. He had been so busy lately, and even now he felt that there was something he was missing. But he was happy just to enjoy any moment of peace he could find. So there he was, walking down the sidewalk, the sun shining overhead in a cloudless, deep blue sky, when there was a meow. Now, being the cat-loving man he was, Shota had no choice but to stop, scan the area around him, and then crouch down next to a shabby-looking alleyway whence he found the source of the noise. A little black kitten crouched into the shadows as he approached it, stopping the motion of his reaching hand about a foot away from the creature. Shota let it hover in the air between them, knuckles down, and made a soft sucking noise with his lips to draw the cat closer. His plastic shopping bag filled with the hard-bought supplies — there had been way too many people in that line for his level of social skills — was just grazing the concrete under him as he swung from the crook of his left elbow. The small, black kitten stopped, backing away, its shackles raised and tail elevated, then slowly seemed to calm down and cautiously creeped forward. "Meow," it called softly. Shota kept still as the creature sniffed his hand, then slowly curled his fingers to scratch under the kitten's chin when it finally gave in to him and purred softly. "It's all right," he murmured quietly, petting the kitten, still in the crouch position, when his knees were starting to protest. "There you go. I'm not so bad, huh? It's okay." And there it was, those words. They brought to his mind the thing that had been bothering him, that nagging thought, feeling, instinct that had been pestering him for weeks. Midoriya. Those same exact words had been used to comfort his students several times over the past half a year or so, and their small meetings meant to comfort Midoriya when he was overwhelmed and just needed a simple assurance from his teacher. Kiro, adult figure, had been as much a comfort to Shota as to the student. They had reassured the man that his student was doing all right. Maybe not in those specific movements, but in general. Because as long as Midoriya was coming to him, as long as the boy was asking for help, then that meant he was receiving help, and that he wasn't so far gone as to be unreasonable and to shut down. Every meeting between them where Shota comforted Midoriya, they soothed Shota's mind, filled with rough-edged worry for her student, kid. But there hadn't been one of those interactions in Aizawa's mind quickly scanned back through his memory, back to the last time where Midoriya had approached him after the last homeroom class of the day and asked if they could go to Aizawa's office. 7 weeks. That was too much. Midoriya had only ever gone over a month and a half between meetings. Once, and that instance had been the worst of them. Aside from the very first one, his student had cried his eyes out, frame shaking and quivering in Aizawa's hold, choked out sobs grating against Aizawa's nerves. His teacher's instincts, and even his parental ones, that he refused to believe existed. And it had now been almost 2 months. Ignoring the kitten, ignoring the way his knees popped when he stood, and the way the plastic bags swung wildly around him, bumping roughly against his legs and swinging as he raced down the sidewalk. Shota sped towards UA High School, hoping against hope that his students would be okay, that nothing too terrible had happened that couldn't be fixed, that Shota hadn't been the cause of a break in his student beyond repair. As he ran, his rational mind screamed at him that it hadn't been his fault, that Midoriya had always approached him when he needed it. Shota had never had to be the one to reach out. It tried to argue with his guilt complex, forcing reasons for the lapse into his brain, like the way he had been focused on teaching on the League of Villains, then the raid on the Chihai Saigai, and then on helping make sure that Eri's quirk didn't get out of control. Didn't the thought of Eri just send his mind spiraling further into worry? Worry for that little girl that couldn't find the light to smile, that was afraid of everything but mostly of all herself. And also another feeling towards that he usually kept down, because admitting it would bring pain to him and to everyone else around him that the emotion was directed towards. But he already failed in completely suppressing that, hadn't he? The answer was yes. If the way his heart, chest, body clenched when he thought of little Eri unable to smile, of Midoriya crying in his arms because he couldn't get assurance from anyone else in his life, when he thought of all his students who had faced so much, when he thought of his co-workers, peers, friends, who always put in the effort to spend time with him even when he couldn't find it in himself to return the favor, too sure that one day he would let that emotion show and they would all be gone. But right now, he couldn't worry about any of that, not when he knew that Eri was safe with Mirio at the park, that his co-workers and students were all enjoying their weekend off. Now all he had to worry about was Midoriya, and making sure that his student was okay, and not drowning in all the fears, pressure, obligations that he felt were being pushed on him at such a young age. And although Shota knew that Midoriya didn't have to do it all alone, that there were people who cared and would willingly help him, Shota himself included, he also knew that the boy didn't know that, couldn't acknowledge that for whatever reason, and believed that he had to do everything on his own. Shota needed to make sure that Midoriya was all right. He had to, because if the boy wasn't all right, if Shota had broken that pure boy, so willing to help others at the cost of himself, then he would never be able to forgive himself. The UA buildings were looming in his vision, and then the gate was a blur as he passed it, somehow having been able to put out his ID card and swipe it through without having to stop. And then he was making a beeline towards the 1A dorm, equally hoping that Midoriya was all right and berating himself for not realizing sooner how long it had been. Some might call him crazy for being so panicked, for not just waiting until the next time he saw his student to ask if he was all right. But those people didn't know what Shota did, didn't know how fragile the mental health of that one student was, they didn't have the flashes of memory that Shota did from just the day before, hastily pushed to the side in favor of getting to an emergency hero meeting he had been called to after class. Memory flashes of Midoriya hanging back behind his friends while the last bell of the school day, Friday, end of the week, rang, looking up through his bangs at Shota as the teacher hastily packed his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and brushed out the room. But Shota did have those memories, and while the scene hadn't presented itself fully, clearly to Shota at the time, while he hadn't properly registered it then, he was now, and he was seeing in his mind all the things he had missed in person. He was seeing, remembering, the way Midoriya's hands had been wringing themselves, scar tissue growing even wider and starker in contrast against pulled tight skin as they were twisting in a way that couldn't be comfortable. He was seeing the deep sorrow in those shaded eyes, and the even greater hesitancy, uncertainty, before the green arms were lost from sight, both as a result of Midoriya lowering his head and turning away, and of Shota rushing out of the room. So no, he wasn't crazy. He wasn't overreacting, and he was not panicking for no reason. He just needed to get to Midoriya, had to see him, had to make sure he was okay, had to make sure that Shota hadn't broken him. His conscious, logical mind did take over. However, when he came up to the Heights Alliance 1A dorm building, the logical, rational, calm part of his brain was telling him that if he rushed in there, as he had been on the Saturday afternoon, that it was when most of the students would be in the lounge relaxing, then he was going to cause panic among them, and then he would have broken a whole class, not just one student. So, forcing his burning, vibrating, restless legs to slow down, he ran up the steps and opened the door, quickly toeing off his shoes and setting his plastic bag, almost forgotten, except for the rustle and bang as he entered, down in a dark corner. A few of the students were relaxing on the couches, and a few more were in the kitchen when he entered, but a quick, frantic scan showed that none of them were the student he needed to see right now, telling his racing heart to calm down. He raised a hopefully not shaking hand to them and lazily waved it, dismissing their questions. "I just have something I need to talk to Midoriya about that I forgot to mention yesterday," he said as he passed them, forcing his voice into his usual lazy, unaffected drawl, but not without great effort. He wanted to be on Midoriya's floor and at his dorm room door right now. "Midoriya hasn't left his room this morning and appeared to be sleeping when I went to check on him earlier," Ida announced in his usual stiff voice, ignoring the way his anxiety spiked. He nodded, smoothly at Ida, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, seemingly keeping an eye on both groups of classmates. He considered taking the elevator, not sure if his shaky legs would let him up the flight of stairs he needed, but quickly dismissed that idea. It was just one flight of stairs to the second floor, where Midoriya's dorm room was, and the sooner he got to Midoriya, the sooner his shaking would stop, hopefully. Though at the moment he didn't ever think he would be calm again. But when was he ever calm? That was just a front he showed the rest of the world, because it was the only way he could stop from unraveling, shattering, falling apart. The floorboards creaked as he jumped up the stairs 2 at a time, but he was on the second floor within moments, and then he had to just find the door with the tacky, all-might name plate hanging on the outside. Taking a deep breath once he got to his destination, or at least a few feet away from his destination, just a few feet, Midoriya was only a few feet away, Aizawa stopped, taking a deep breath to calm himself and making sure none of his nervousness, anxiety, panic was showing on his face. His body was finally starting to still, the shaking ceasing now that he was so close, as it always did just before a villain fight. He needed to be calm to handle things. So his body calmed down. It was just natural as how it started shaking in anticipation of whatever it was that was supposed to happen. Knock, knock. His fist rapped against the reinforced wood of the door, made to protect the students, but only from the outside in, couldn't protect them from the inside out. And then he waited, straining his senses to detect something, anything, there. A rustle of sheets, and too jerky to be that of someone shifting in their sleep. "Midoriya," he called out, surprising even himself at how steady his voice was. "It's Aizawa. Can I come in?" There was silence, and then the sound of a deep breath, or rather what was supposed to be a deep breath. It hitched partway through, and a few more quick, panicky ones followed. Shota's heart clenched even more at the sound, already picturing Midoriya's form curled up on his bed, blankets a mess around him, hands wrapped around his knees, keeping them pressed against his chest. "Midoriya," he called one more time. He didn't want to have to invade his student's privacy by breaking down the door, but he would if the situation called for it, and this was getting pretty close. Yeah, there it was. It was quiet, faint, but it was there, and it was Midoriya, his kid. I'm coming in. Is that okay? Aizawa was practically buzzing with nervous, scared, anxious energy, but he wanted to make sure his student, his kid, Izuku, knew what was happening. Yeah. Breathing out once, trying to calm his racing heart, Aizawa tried turning the doorknob. Locked. It was to be expected. Even though he didn't like it, it made him waste precious seconds digging his master keycard out of his pocket to swipe against the door handle before the light flashed green and the door opened for him, clearing the way to his hurting student. Now, all he had to do was make it so his student wasn't hurting anymore. He stepped into the dim room. The blinds were still closed, and the light shining in from the hallway behind him made it hard for his eyes to adjust. But once the door swung shut behind him, his eyes were able to make the adjustments necessary, and he was offered the sight of his student sitting on his bed, sheets folded in heavy creases around him, knees drawn up to his chest, and head ducked into them as he tried to make himself as small as possible. It was too close to the image Aizawa had already formed in his head to do anything but hurt. Aizawa pushed down the sharp pang of pain for the moment, and made sure to keep his steps soft as he stepped towards the bed. Midoriya didn't raise his head, didn't say anything to acknowledge his teacher's presence. But he didn't have to. The way his body shifted, just the slightest bit, angling towards Aizawa, and hands loosening against his pajama pant legs, that was enough, at least for the hyperactive gaze of Aizawa in that moment. Izuku, can I open the curtains? His voice was soft, feather light, and the jerky nod Midoriya gave in reply was anything but. It was tense, stiff, like rusted wires being forced to move out of the positions they had been stuck in for so long. All they needed, though, was for something to coach them back to bendability, where they could mold and form to any situation required of them, without being stretched beyond their breaking point. And that was what Midoriya needed. The afternoon sun shone in through the large dorm windows, diffusing the whole room with a comforting light. The room was neat, aside from the bed, books stacked in neat piles, clothes tucked away in the laundry basket. It didn't reflect the mindset of its owner at all, and somehow, that was even worse than if it had been a complete mess. Izuku, the boy shifted. Aizawa moved closer to the bed, standing almost at the edge of it, but making sure to not tower over his student. Can I touch you? Midoriya shuffled back towards his wall even more, drawing his knees tighter and shaking his head. Trying not to let his worry overcome him, Aizawa tried a different tactic. Izuku, what's wrong? Can I do something to help? I want to help you, kiddo. I don't want to need you. Midoriya's small voice drifted across the space, bringing sharp swords with it that pierced Aizawa's soul. He did not think hearing the kid say he didn't want him would hurt so much, but it did. It hurt so much. Kiddo, what do you mean? You don't want to need me? I don't understand. Midoriya broke. His shoulders hitched. His head curled down until it was completely hidden, and soon his whole body was jerking with sobs. His voice was muffled and somewhat nasally, but Aizawa strained to hear it. I keep coming to you for such stupid reasons. I don't want you to have to deal with it, he cried. Aizawa went to say something, but Midoriya continued talking, and the man didn't want to interrupt. I want to be able to help myself, to do it on my own. I was trying so hard, but I still wanted to come to you. But you're not always going to be there. Aizawa waited. 1 second, 2, then spoke. Izuku, why do you think you should do this by yourself? It's okay to need help. I promise. And I promise it doesn't bother me. I want you to come find me when you're feeling down. At least then I know you're getting the help you need. He tried to put everything he was feeling into his voice so the kid would understand. Usually, he did everything so he could hide his feelings, to not show any weakness or emotion. But for this student, his child, his kid, he was having to use different tactics. He wasn't hating it, surprisingly. Midoriya seemed to be wavering, his eyes peeking over the top of his knees. They were shiny and glassy. That much Aizawa could tell from the small sliver available. He kept talking, knowing that he would do anything possible to help this kid. Izuku, I know I don't know much about you and your life outside of the school. I know that you've gone through much. I don't know what you've gone through, or are going through, but that doesn't matter to me. I don't need to know. I'll listen if you want to tell me, and if you ask for help. I'll do anything I can to help you, but it doesn't matter. I don't need to know everything to be there for you. I'm here for you now, and I will be here for as long as much. And I will be for as long and as much as I can. If you need someone to hold you, I'll do that. I'll do it as long as I'm able. I promise. No, you'll get annoyed and tell me to go away. He hid his face in his knees again, and Aizawa's heart fell into scattered pieces on the floor. Why did he get so attached to this student, this kid? He always cared about his students. He knew that, and those closest to him, he knew it as well. He couldn't help it. He just cared too much to not care about his students. But this, with Midoriya, the love and protectiveness, the desire to wrap him in his arms and never let go, it was definitely more than he was used to feeling. He wasn't used to being so parental. And if Hizashi or Nomuri ever heard him admit that, he would never hear the end of it. Aizawa hesitated, not wanting to push boundaries, but also knowing that it is exactly what he had to do. So he put one knee on the bed hesitantly and reached out with a hand towards Izuku. The kid lifted his head an inch or so, until Aizawa could see the tears gleaming in his eyes. But Midoriya didn't react any more than that Aizawa finished his motion. When Midoriya didn't react any more than that, Aizawa finished his motion and set his hand on the boy's head. He shifted to sit more fully on the bed, then moved his hand to the back of Midoriya's head, near his nape, and softly tugged the boy to his chest, arms coming up to wrap tightly around him. Midoriya's face was pressed into his chest, tears and all, and Aizawa could feel him taking a deep breath in. I will never get annoyed with you or send you away. I will always be here for you when you need me, or I will try to be at least. And I'll tell you that as many times as you need me to. And if you get to a point where you no longer need me, which I don't doubt you will, then I will respect that. I promise, Izuku. I just want to help. The dam broke once again, and Midoriya clutched at Aizawa's shirt with trembling hands, whole body jerking in with the force of his sobs. Aizawa sat there through it all, stoic and calm on the outside, and being ripped apart with worry and protective instincts on the inside. If you asked them how long they sat there before Midoriya had run out of tears, they wouldn't have been able to tell you. But Aizawa would say that he would have sat there forever if his kid needed it. And Midoriya would only be able to tell you that he eventually fell asleep, secure in his teacher's arms, and in the knowledge that he would always be able to go to the man for anything he needed, even if it was for something as simple as being told that it was okay. Because it was, as long as they could be there for each other, one to help and the other to be helped. It was what they needed, both of them, and neither of them had plans of stopping any time soon. They would have their ups and downs, highs and lows, because there always is something that goes wrong, but only they would get through them together and come out stronger on the other end. And if, along the way, the relationship became more like father-son than teacher-student, well, Who am I to tell their story beyond this point? All I can say is that as long as they had each other to rely on, everything would be okay. Alright, everyone, that is the end of this fic entitled It's Okay by Bema Cabo. This was a really sad one. I'm not even kidding. I had to choke back tears and stifle a sob. But, poor Izuku in this one. They really formed an attachment, and I really like this one so much. Thank you so much, Bema Cabo, for making this fic. I hope you all have a fantastic day, and drink your coffee. Dadzawa for life will come at me for that. I mean water. And yeah, you better hope that Cheese God comments cheese first, because I'm about to get my life thrown away. Have an awesome day, everyone.